liberdade de imprensa na região é uma das preocupações do Conselho das Américas, organização sediada em Nova York, que promove a democracia no hemisfério. Conversamos com o diretor do Conselho das Américas, Christopher Sabatini.
What are the main threats to freedom of the press in Latin America right now?
It's different than during the times when there was a military government, when you had censorship and just outright control over the media in those times. Now they're much more varied. In one cases you have a proliferation of laws of desacato, laws of defamation that provides very strict penalties against journalists who speak out against public officials, and that obviously clearly has a big effect. You also have the effects of in places like Venezuela, where the government is taking over TV stations, either for invented cases of licensing or just because the claim that they're in opposition or a threat, or inciting rebellion or violence has also been used. You also have a much more insidious thing as well, which is narco-trafficking, which in this case the enemy is not as direct. It's not a government, it's not overt state repression. This is in cases of lawlessness, where speaking out against a narco-trafficker, naming names of criminal gangs, exposing police corruption, can earn you a death threat and often murder. So these are some of the main threats, but they're much more varied and much more complicated to deal with.
Besides Venezuela, where are the other places where it's dangerous to be a journalist?
Well, the worst place to be a journalist right now is in Cuba. There are over 200 political prisoners in Cuba. Many of them there were arrested in 2003. The 73 dissidents in March 2003 were serving as independent journalists. In Colombia, the threat against journalists is often, again, for reasons of exposing narcotics trafficking, exposing paramilitaries, and there is somewhat of a impunity for people who commit acts of aggression or intimidation against the press. But I think the other reason that we're seeing this deterioration, again, has to do with lawlessness. Throughout the countries, places like Honduras, places like Guatemala, Mexico, Venezuela, Brazil, Peru, places where narcotics trafficking and really the lack of a coherent, effective state that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of power is always a threat for journalists.
In some countries like Bolivia, Peru, Argentina, the government is trying to take over the press. What's going on?
In places like Bolivia and Peru and Argentina, what's happening is the government is attempting to break up, through the use of laws or selective licensing, media groups and newspapers and television stations that are seen as being critical. Politicians often have very little tolerance for being criticized. That's universal. But in many of these cases, the concentration of political power, in the case of like Argentina or Bolivia, has given these politicians a great amount of authority to be able to denounce, insult, intimidate, and even in some cases take over media outlets. Another thing that's happened also in the case of Venezuela is the government has used its authority to close down television stations that are critical of it, but then also to license pro-government radio stations, in particular in Venezuela and in Bolivia. And the effect that has had is to polarize the media in many ways and provide a mouthpiece for the government that in many ways runs contrary to the very notion of an independent and free press.